صلوا على محمد وآل Muhammad. So before we get started, I have a few announcements to make. The Islamic Center of America is holding a fashion show for women only. It is next Saturday, April 23rd from 2 to 5, and tickets are only $20. It's going to be displaying Islamic modest fashion. So inshallah, if anybody would like tickets, please come see me. And also next week, our program is going to be celebrating the birth of Imam Ali alayhi salam. And so we are going to have a lecture with Sayyid Saleh Al-Amin. And we are going to have poetry by Sister Fatima Najdeh and a maulid by Brother Rami Bjaja. And there's also going to be gifts and raffles for children. So if you have any children, please bring them. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker of the night, who is going to be speaking about Imam Ali alayhi salam. Hassan Ali is a resident of Dearborn, Michigan, where he serves as a local community organizer and as the director of programming for the Muslim group of USA and Canada. He is a proponent of a return to literacy and classical learning in Islamic tradition and promotes a renewal of the Islamic sciences and spiritual doctrines in the lives of Muslims living in the West. If you could please help me introduce our speaker, Brother Hassan Ali, ba'da salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا حبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبا القاسم محمد اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت السميع العليم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما والحمد لله رب العالمين. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. We're in the month of Rajab. Alhamdulillah. Rajab is the beginning of a spiritual season, a season of spiritual renewal in our tradition. And this year, it coincides with the coming of spring, when life springs forth. And in a few days' time, the 13th of Rajab, as you all know, is the occasion of Imam Ali's birth, alayhi salam, the birth of the archetypal example of spiritual radiance in the Islamic tradition. So Rajab is a time for us to have presence with God, to reflect, to think. It's a time of renewal. It's a time for us to take pause and to have stillness and sakina in our hearts. And it's a time of recollection, because this tradition, it's about recollection. It's about, we use the term dhikr. And dhikr is not just the recitation of scripture. It's not just the remembrance of God. It's the remembrance of what it is that makes us human beings. It's the remembrance of our purpose, and it's a remembrance of those individuals who stand as uswatun hasan, as an example for us to follow, as the best of examples. So it's really an opportune time for us to recall the Imam Ali alayhi salam, and to open our hearts to the vast ethos of an individual who embodied human perfection in a very unique and very singular way, in a way that has not been repeated and will never be repeated in the course of human history. And in order to understand the beauty and the splendor of the perfection of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, we have to pause from our daily lives and step outside the modern context. And there's a reason for this. We live in an age of modernity, and the people of modern times, modern people, they're not people of presence. They're not people of stillness. They're not people of contemplation. We have short attention spans. You know, the things that consume us are all very short in and of themselves. We read Facebook statuses and tweets. We send Snapchats and Vines, and we listen to sound bites and video clips. And for a lot of people, that's where the depth of our engagement with one another and the depth of our engagement even with our tradition, that's where it ends. We're dabblers. We dabble in things. We take on hobbies. You know, one day I'm interested in painting, the next day I want to learn an instrument, the next day I want to go climb a mountain. And the people of pre-modern times, they weren't dabblers. They were people of antiquity, and they might not have had the technology and the advancements that we have, but they had something very different. They had the concept of mastery. And mastery and dabbling are the antithesis of one another. And that's why when we talk about the Islamic tradition, in the view of modernity, we're talking about two worldviews that are the antithesis of one another. The people of antiquity, the people of pre-modern times, were people who were in tune with nature. They did not live in cities polluted with light, so that when nighttime came and they looked upon the stars, they saw the heavens in all of their glory. They knew the winds, the northerly wind and the southerly wind and the easterly wind and the westerly wind. And they had names for the winds. They had names for the trees and the vegetation and the flowers that were around them. They were in tune with their surroundings. And they were people of presence, people of stillness, people of contemplation, people of tradition. And they had depth and meaning in their lives. They had serenity. They had poetry. They had language. And language is one of those things that we've lost. You know, the English language peaked in the Elizabethan era. The Arabic language peaked at the time of the Prophet. Yes, more people are literate today, but we've defined literacy as the technical ability to read and write. But that's not what literacy is. That's just the first step. It's an enabler. But literacy, true literacy, is much deeper. People these days graduate from high school and they have the technical ability to read and write, but give them Shakespeare and they don't understand. They need Cliff's Notes. They need some kind of guide. They need an interpreter, an explainer, a mufassir. And it's the same way with our tradition. People read the Quran, if they can read Arabic, and they say, well, what does this mean? So, pre-modern people, they had this tradition of mastery. And it was, mastery is not becoming a master of something. That's not what mastery is. Mastery is this idea of sacred monotony, of going out every single day and perfecting your craft and getting better every single day. It's dedication, it's lifelong dedication. People were craftsmen, they were artisans. You had blacksmiths, and you had carpenters, you had archers, you had people who mastered different types of crafts, and they engaged in these crafts their entire lives. And the practice of these things gave them meaning, and it gave them purpose. And they took on disciples, and they taught the disciples the things that they learned, and then their disciples would go on to perfect it further. This is a tradition of mastery that we've lost. There are no more craftsmen in the world. There are no more artisans. Art these days is about deconstruction. It's about, even you look at what's termed as modern art, and it's bizarre. It's strange. It doesn't have any structure. It's ambiguous. And that's because we live in a world that's ideologically ambiguous. We live in a world that's morally ambiguous. We live in a world of moral relativism. Pre-modern people, they were people of certainty, people of truth. And the reason that I talk about mastery is because if we want to understand the Imam, we have to understand that he was the master's master. He was the teacher's teacher. He was the master of what's known in our tradition as futuwa. Futuwa is like chivalry. And chivalry is dead. It encompasses notions of honor, of valor, of dignity, of gallantry and bravery on the battlefield, even fearlessness. And Imam Ali was certainly all of those things, As-Allah, the Lion of God. But futuwa is more than that. It's also a type of spiritual mastery. And the Imam was a person of a very unique and singular spiritual relation with God. He embodies the archetype of spiritual radiance in our tradition. If you look at all of the spiritual orders, the Sufi tariqas in the Islamic tradition, every single one of them in their silsila, in their chain, they go back to Imam Ali. Shi'i, these are theologically, some of them are Sunnis, but they all in their chain, they call it the golden chain. And they all go back to the Imam, except for one, the Naqshbandi order. But even they, in their silsila, they include Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq. So it has that Alid fragrance about it. Okay. So the Imam, he was that archetype of spiritual radiance in our tradition. And he was a person of discipline, of presence. And when we say presence, it's not just worldly presence. It's presence with the divine. He was present with God, and because he was present with God, he was present with the creation of God. Because presence with God is a prerequisite. It's through presence with God that you can see the subtleties of life. And through presence with God, you attain that stillness in your heart, that sakina. So the Imam, despite the fact that he was a warrior, he was a seasoned warrior, and he bled for this religion. Battle of Badr, they say they counted 18 wounds on his body after the Battle of Badr. He bled for this religion, and he had ferocity on the battlefield. He had a prowess a martial prowess. Martial as in martial arts. But if you met him, you'd say he was the most gentle person in the world. It's almost impossible to understand. And it's because his heart was soft. This religion, it's a religion of the heart. It's about the language of the Quran is written in the language of the heart. It talks about the hardness and the softness of hearts. And the Imam had a very soft heart. And that's what God intended for us. He intended for us to have soft hearts. He intended for us to be compassionate, and the Imam was very compassionate, to be merciful, to be benevolent, and to be humble. Abu Turab, the father of dust, that was his favorite name, his favorite kunya, the father of dust. The other Sahabis, they favored the other companions of the Prophet, they favored different names. Uthman liked to be called Dhul Nurayn, the one of two lights. Imam Ali liked to be called Abu Turab, the father of dust. So, futuwa, in our tradition, to describe it to you, it's similar to what the Danish Christian philosopher Kierkegaard calls the night of faith. He wrote a meditation on Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam about the test of faith that God gives to Nabi Ibrahim, telling him to sacrifice his son. It's called Fear and Trembling. And in this philosophical treatise, he contrasts what's called the concept of the night of faith with what he calls the tragic hero. And I want to read this to you. He said, even the most tried of tragic heroes walks with a dancing step compared to the night of faith. The night of faith comes slowly, deliberately, mindfully, creeping forward. And if you've perceived this and assured yourself that you have not the courage to understand it, you can at least catch a glimpse of the marvelous glory that the night of faith attains, and that he becomes God's intimate acquaintance, the Lord's friend. Now, this is very perceptive of Kierkegaard to describe the concept of the night of faith, and that he's God's intimate acquaintance, the Lord's friend. Now, he was talking about Abraham. We know in our tradition that Abraham is Khalilullah. He's the friend of God. But it also applies to the Imam in concept, because the Imam is Waliullah. He is also the friend of God. So this is the Imam. He was the friend of God. He's the holy warrior, the one who holds the sword, but the one who rightly holds the sword. Because there are some people who hold the sword and they're not righteous. He's the one who rightly holds the sword because he has slayed his inward demons with his inward sword. He has defeated the ego, slayed his inward demons. The nafsul ammara, the self that incites toward evil. Hence the two-pronged or double-pointed sword, Dhul Fiqar. And it's two-pronged, it's double-pointed because it's a metaphor. And there's a lot of metaphors of great meaning in our tradition. It's a metaphor. Not only does it stand as a sword, as an emblem of outward jihad against the enemies of the religion and those who seek to do corruption on earth, but the second point represents the inward sword, the sword of jihadun nafs. And it's what Rumi calls the sword of merciful self-restraint in one of his poems when he's talking about Dhul Fiqar. He calls it the sword of merciful self-restraint because it's sharper than any saber of steel. You know, the martial prowess of the warrior on the battlefield is merely a subordination of subjugating the ego within, because you can't uphold justice in the world unless you have justice within yourself. And you can't spread mercy in the world unless you have mercy within yourself. So there's an outward and there's an inward. And that's what the Imam was. He was the embodiment of perfection inwardly that emanated outward into the world. And that type of emanation is luminous. When it's a source of justice and a source of mercy in the world, it's luminous and it illuminates everything that's around you because it stands as an example for others to follow. Hence the epic saying in our tradition, La fata illa Ali, wa la sayfun illa dhul fiqar. There is no chivalrous knight but Ali, and there is no sword but Dhul Fiqar. So this was the Imam. He was that chivalrous knight, the knight of faith, the Kierkegaardian knight of faith, mounted upon his steed, wielding Dhul Fiqar, the double-pronged sword of inward justice, inward mercy and outward justice. He was the holy warrior, the one who halts before the mountain of truth, resigned to the divine will of God, the one who is serene and calm and exacting with himself, yet spirited and active toward the world, and all but kind and generous and benevolent and loving toward the creation of God. This is the Imam. And yet, it's not the Imam. It's a description. You know, the Imam, words don't do justice. You know, so what we've mentioned so far is just a little perfume, just a little fragrance to remember him by. Now, we mentioned that the two-pointed sword, Dhul Fiqar, is itself an elegant metaphor for outward justice and inward merciful self-restraint, as Rumi said. And justice and mercy, there are two qualities that are essential to the spiritual ethos of the Imam. And when we say ethos, we're talking about his moral character. It's related to ethics. And they, mercy and justice, they manifest in the Imam as what we call a tajalli, a sort of a preeminent metaphysic of the divine attributes of God, because everything goes back to God. The divine attributes, the names of God, they're instilled within us. They're essentialized in our fitrah, our primordial human nature, because it carries the fragrance of the divine spirit. Fitratullah allati fatara an-nasu alayha. So they're instilled within our fitrah because they're attributes that are rooted in God himself, justice and mercy. These are attributes of God. He is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the compassionate, the merciful, and he is Al-Adil, the just. But what is justice? And what is mercy? Now, we probably have some basic conception of what justice and what mercy are. Some rudimentary understanding. Or maybe for some of you it's a sophisticated understanding. I don't want to presume. But as it turns out, there are no simple definitions for justice and mercy. These are two forces that people have struggled with since the beginning of human history, because they represent two of the essential forces that we grapple with in the world: the force of justice and the force of mercy. You know, we all have desire for justice, especially when we're wronged. You know, we want justice to be done. We want our rights. But if we wrong somebody, then suddenly we have desire for mercy and we want forgiveness. So there's a paradox between justice and mercy. In the course of human history, people have really reconciled to reconcile these two forces, the force of justice and the force of mercy. And if you look at literature is representative of the human condition, especially great literature, which no longer is being written in the 21st century. But justice and mercy are two of the most pervasive themes in the great Western classics, for example. Like Victor Hugo. He wrote Les Miserables. My French is horrible. But, you know, if any of you have read the novel, justice and mercy, the whole story is about this dialectic clash between justice and mercy. Has anyone read it? Yes? No? One person? No readers here? The Jean Valjean, he represents mercy, and he's struggling against the system, which represents justice. And in the end, one of these two forces triumphs over the other. But I won't tell you what happens. So, to understand why justice and mercy are paradoxical, we have to look toward God, because God is truth, al-haq. And all truth and all meaning emanates from God. I bet Zainab read it. What? Les Miserables? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So he's the truth, al-haq. All meaning and all truth emanates from God. And his are the most beautiful names. So he is Rahman, Rahim. He is the compassionate, the merciful. And he is Adil, the just. And these are attributes, names that we use to describe God. And they exist in our tradition, and they exist in other traditions as well. But there are nuances to these attributes, and it's important for us to understand these nuances. So let me step outside of our tradition. If you look at Catholics have what they call the way of the via negativa, the way of negation in Latin. And what it means is it's the way of the unknowable God. And it's actually borrowed from the Islamic tradition, because the 13th century theologian, St. Thomas Aquinas, who was the chief theologian, is the chief theologian of the Catholic tradition, he essentially lifted his philosophy and his theology from the Islamic tradition. His Summa Theologica is a translation of Ibn Sina into Catholicism. You know, so he writes about the God that cannot be temporal, that cannot be placed in time or place. You know, and he had a conception of God that, while it was not complex, it was of an unknowable, simple reality. So these are understandings about God that Catholics had centuries ago. It's similar in the Vedic tradition. You know, the God of the Nirguna, They say, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Now, in our tradition, and you'll understand a little more what that means, in our tradition, we believe that God is unlike anything. The scholars say, جواز إطاقة الشيء على الله مجاز, that to call God a thing in our language when we speak is majaz. We can call God a thing. Why? Because we can't say that God is nothing. We can't say that He's no thing. We can't deny God in that way. But it's problematic because the word for thing in Arabic is shay'. And the word shay' in Arabic means willed into existence. And God is not willed into existence. He wills into existence. Existence is predicated on Him. So the shay' is in the mashi'ah, it's in the will of God. That's why we say, when we marvel at the creation of God, we say, MashaAllah. You know, because everything that God created, they're embedded in our language as a metaphysic of creation. But we call God a thing only out of adab and only out of necessity, to affirm that He is not no thing. But we must also understand that there is nothing like Him. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There is nothing like God. And that's why Imam Ali, in the first sermon of Nahj al-Balagha, and the genesis of this sermon, it has a nice story. So it was during the Battle of Jamal. And you all know what the Battle of Jamal is about. The forces of Imam Ali were gathered, and an Arab Bedouin comes to them, and he says, "What do you mean in your saying that God is one?" Now these people were getting ready for battle. The enemy was there. And this guy is coming up to them and he says, "What do you mean in your saying that God is one?" So the fighters, they had little patience with him. They told him, "Not now. We're about to start fighting." And the Imam heard this and he rebuked the people. He rebuked his fighters. He told them, "No, this man is after what our hearts are after." And right there on the battlefield, he gave one of the most amazing sermons in our tradition, where he reveals the nuances and secrets of Tawheed in our tradition. It's the first sermon of Nahj al-Balagha. And books can be written about this sermon. Books, volumes. And we don't have time for all that today, but I'm just going to take a few words, a few lines that are instructive for us to understand the nuances of the attributes of God. He says, أَوَّلُ الدِّينِ مَعْرِفَتِهِ. The underlying principle of religion is to know God. وَكَمَالُ مَعْرِفَتِهِ التَّصْدِيقُ لَهُ. The perfection of knowing God is to testify to God. You say, أَشْهَدُ أَنْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. I bear witness, I testify. وَكَمَالُ التَّصْدِيقُ لَهُ تَوْحِيدُهُ. The perfection of testifying to Him is to affirm His oneness. أَشْهَدُ أَنْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ وَحْدَهُ لَا شَرِيكَ لَهُ. You affirm the unity of God, the absolute, indivisible, eternal unicity of the Creator. And then he says, وَكَمَالُ تَوْحِيدُهُ الْإِخْلَاصُ لَهُ. And the perfection of affirming the unity of God is to regard Him pure. To regard Him pure, meaning homogeneous, indivisible. وَكَمَالُ الْإِخْلَاصُ لَهُ نَفِيَ الصِّفَاتُ عَنْهُ. And this is the key. The perfection of regarding him pure is to deny him any attributes. نَفِيَ الصِّفَاتُ عَنْهُ. This is the God that we worship. The God whose reality to human beings of limited intellect is unknowable. We can't know the true reality of God. Even the Prophet, when he ascended, it says, فَكَانَ قَابَ قَوْسَيْنِ أَوْ أَدْنَى. He was within 2 bows' length or nearer to the divine presence, and that's how close he could go. And he was the Prophet. But the seat of the throne, the essence, the eye of the eye, is ultimately unknowable. And part of what's problematic about trying to rationalize God is that he revealed himself to us through language. So we have linguistic problems. Language is problematic when we apply it to God, because language creates ambiguities. It speaks in the tongue of ideas and concepts. And these ideas and concepts, you can't pin them down. The more you try to pin them down, the more elusive they become. And that's why the reality of the divine attributes is such that they have no limit or no way for us to define them, because a definition is not just intended to give you the meaning of a concept. It defines, it sets limits, it creates boundaries. That's why it's called a definition. And when you talk about God, God is limitless. There are no boundaries. So there's a paradox here. We have names for God in our tradition, and we affirm the names of God. He is Rahman Rahim. He is Adil, Al-Qabid, Al-Basit, Al-Hakim, Al-Sami'a, Al-Alim. He is all of these things, but he is not any of these things in and of themselves. It's like when the sum is greater than the totality of its parts. And the sum is indivisible. And it's beyond rational comprehension. What our tradition is trying to tell us through this simultaneous affirmation and negation of divine attributes when it comes to God is that this is not something for you to discern rationally. You have to open your hearts to a deeper mode of knowing in order to understand. The Imam says in the same sermon, he says, my Lord is not described in terms of dimension, bu'ad, or motion, haraka, or rest, sukun, nor through coming and going. He is subtle in subtlety, but not described by subtlety. Magnificent in magnificence, but not described by magnificence. Great in greatness, but not described by greatness. The attributes are again being affirmed and denied. God possesses these attributes, but we can't reduce God to these attributes. So, why do they exist? They exist so that we can have some conception of God. But we have to understand in our conception of God that God cannot be reduced to our conceptions. God is greater. Allahu Akbar. Always. And, you even notice it's in the Shahada. The Shahada is a negation and then an affirmation. La ilaha. There is no God. Illallah. But God. So, when we say that God is Rahman Rahim, that he is compassionate, merciful, benevolent, this is language. It's sacred language, but it's language that God has given us to approximate the meaning of mercy in our consciousness. But mercy is not a definition for God. Because if you define God, you limit him. And God has no limits. And that's why, some of the translations of the Quran that we have are better than others. Some of them, they'll say, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the all-compassionate, the all-merciful. Why? Why are you being so descriptive? All-compassionate, all-merciful. It's better to be ambiguous. The more you try to define God, the more error you're going to commit. So, the inner reality of God's nature is ultimately unknowable. He's what we call lub al-lubab. The inner reality, the ultimate truth. It's the kernel of the kernel, the eye of the eye, the heart of the heart. What we see and what we experience in the world, these are manifestations, these are emanations. They're like reflections and refractions of light coming from God, because God is light upon light. So, when we talk about justice and we talk about mercy and we talk about the divine attributes, we have to always recall, and the atheists try to do this. They come to you with rational arguments and they say, if God is all merciful, he will forgive you for your sins. And if he is just, he will punish you for your sins. God is all merciful, God is all just, therefore, it's illogical, God doesn't exist. That's one of the basic arguments. And the problem with that is, who told you that we agree with your premise? We don't agree that you can say God is all merciful and God is all just. We don't define God in our tradition. Allahu Akbar is greater. So, in order to understand mercy and justice for our purposes, we have to first understand the concept of beauty in the Islamic tradition. In Islam, we have a concept called ihsan. Ihsan. It means virtue, or excellence of moral conduct, of character. And the word ihsan comes from husn. And husn means beauty. So ihsan can be understood as high moral conduct, high morality, high comportment that makes the soul beautiful. And in our tradition, it's an aesthetic. It's an aesthetic because it's related to the concept of beauty. It's defined as the art of putting knowledge, of putting ilm in its proper place. Having good adab, good akhlaq, good morals, high comportment. It's the art of what? Of putting knowledge in its proper place. In the same way that the adib, the poet, puts words in their proper place to compose an eloquent poem. So, in our tradition, there's a link, there's an inseparable link between the intellect and ethics and aesthetics. And that's why the Imam says that the excellence of the intellect, of the aql, is in the beauty of things outward and inward. Jamal al-dhawahir wal-bawatin. The excellence of the intellect is the beauty of things outward and inward, because outward beauty of form and action is a reflection of inward beauty of the soul. It's a reflection of our inward virtue. That's why the Prophet said, Inna Allaha jamilun yuhibbu al-jamal. God is beautiful, and He loves beauty. So when we cultivate beautiful traits within ourselves, we beautify ourselves. We make ourselves beautiful. And in doing so, we make ourselves lovable to God, because God is beautiful and He loves beauty. And the highest character traits, the best names, are those of God's. Which is why the Prophet said, تَخَلَّقُوا بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ. Adorn yourselves with the character traits of God that are derived from His names. And the reason why I'm talking about ihsan, our topic is justice and mercy, in the spiritual ethos of the Imam, it's that the definition for ihsan is very similar to the definition of justice in our tradition. We said that ihsan is the art of putting ilm in its proper place by way of high comportment, by way of having good akhlaq. This is almost precisely the definition of justice in our tradition. Imam Ali said, justice is that which puts things in their proper place. The correct allowance of rights in all of their appropriate places. So far as one is giving everything its proper due, that person is being just. When you give each person their right, their haqq, you're being just. And the only way to attain justice in a universal sense is to allot each thing and everything in existence its proper due. So, ihsan, or virtue, is at the heart of the concept of justice in our tradition. Because you have to be good in order to do good. You have to be inwardly just in order to be outwardly just. You have to be present with God in order to be present with the creation of God. So we started talking about presence. And presence with God means being attuned to the divine attributes in a tawheedi sense, in a holistic way, not in a sort of compartmentalized way. Because the divine attributes, as we mentioned, they're not separate entities. They're not limits for God to be defined by. They're universals. And when we understand that they're universals, we understand that they all complement one another. And that's exactly why in our tradition, the principle of mercy and compassion is inseparable from justice. And that's why I wanted to talk about both mercy and justice, because there's a very strong relationship between the two. Mercy is an intrinsic aspect of justice. And this is a fundamental belief in our tradition. In fact, we believe that justice is not justice unless it's seasoned with mercy. And if it doesn't have mercy in it, then it's something else, and it can't be called justice. The two are inseparable. And to illustrate this truth, because it's a universal truth, truths are universal. They're true at all times and in all places. I want to step outside the Islamic tradition. And it's good to do this. It's good to go outside of your tradition and to look for meaning everywhere, because meaning is everywhere. The poet said, إِنَّمَا الْكَوْنُ مَعَانٍ قَائِمَةٌ بِالصُّوَرِ كُلُّ مَنْ يُدْرِكُ هَذَا كَانَ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْعِبَرِ. This whole cosmos is a set of meanings set up in images. And whoever understands that is from the people of discernment, the people of ibar. So, Shakespeare, in his play The Merchant of Venice, one of the main characters, Portia, she disguises herself as a magistrate. And there's a dispute between two of the characters in the play, and the claimant in the dispute is demanding justice. He wants his right from the other party. And she comes in, she has a personal stake, and she pleads with him to have mercy. So listen. Listen to what she says. She says, "The quality of mercy is not strained," meaning the quality of mercy can't be limited. You can't confine it. "The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath." So it comes from a high source. It comes from heaven. "It is twice blessed," mercy. "It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes." So there's a double blessing in mercy. "'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, an attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings." Meaning that people, they have this dread and fear of the king who holds the scepter, which is the emblem of awe and majesty and temporal power in the world. Wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this scepter. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show likest God's, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice, none of us should see salvation. If God was going to be strictly just with all of us, none of us would see salvation. We all do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render deeds of mercy unto other people. I have spoke thus much to mitigate the justice of thy plea. Now this is Shakespeare. He's writing here. There are levels of meaning in literature. People don't study this anymore. There's the literal, which is what the text means. And then there's metaphors and imagery, which are representative of metaphoric meaning. And then there's a third level of meaning, which is writing on a moral level. And then there's the highest level of meaning, which is the anagogical, the spiritual level. And Shakespeare here, he's writing on the anagogical level. He's writing on that highest level of meaning. And you can see the power of his expression in his words, because he's expressing a universal truth. These truths, they're there for all of humanity. God placed them in the world. And some people had the ability to perceive and to benefit. So what we can understand is that mercy is essential to justice. And in fact, mercy in and of itself is an all-encompassing force, which is why Islam calls on us to act with mercy and with compassion, not merely in the course of justice, in the course of putting things in their right place, but rather Islam tells us to expand compassion and mercy wherever and whenever it's called for, throughout the course of our lives, in a manner such that mercy conforms with justice, in being in harmony with the nature of reality, because all of reality is subordinate to the will of God. And that's precisely why, for instance, every chapter of the Quran begins with, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Every chapter except one. It's also why God tells us in the Quran, Rahmati wasi'at kulla shay. My mercy encompasses all things. So there's an all-encompassing aspect to mercy. Why? Because kataba rabbukum ala nafsihi rahmah. God has ordained for himself mercy. And he did it out of mercy. Because it's twice blessed, it gives and it takes. That's why we say in the supplication, Ya man sabaqat rahmatuhu ghadaba. O you whose mercy has preceded his wrath. Because we all supplicate mercy. Now, this inherent link between justice and mercy is exactly the type of spiritual ethos that Imam Ali embodied in his dispensation of justice and mercy in the world. If you study his life closely, you'll find that single moment he was always searching for mercy. He was looking for it. You know, if somebody came to confess his sin, he'd tell him, repent, seek forgiveness. You know, there are other ways. There are punishments that can be meted out. But he always looked for a different type of expression. And this is the example that he set. You know, in the Battle of Siffin, for example, you all know the story, I'm sure. Muawiyah and his forces would not let the forces of Imam Ali take water from the river after the battle. And the very next day, what happens? The Imam and his forces capture the river, right? And there's a battle that took place from that day, and Muawiyah has wounded them, and they ask for water, and the Imam says, take. Why? Because he's setting an example. It's not just the physical battle that needs to be won. There's something deeper. But perhaps the most instructive example from Imam Ali's life comes from his letter to Malik al-Ashtar. He appointed Malik al-Ashtar as governor of Egypt. And you find that there is one instance where the Imam was very strict. And he was strict with the people who were vested in power, who were appointed to positions of power. Those were the people that he was strict with. Everyone else, it would look very different. And I said I won't read it, but I want to read a paragraph because it's good for us to hear the words of the Imam. He said, be aware, Malik. I'm directing you to a land which has been ruled states, just and unjust before you, and that the people will evaluate your conduct just as you evaluated the conduct of governors for you. They will speak about you just as you spoke about them. And the righteous are proven such only through what God has caused to flow through the tongues of his servants. So let your most beloved treasure be the treasure of virtuous acts, of ihsan. Dominate your inclinations, your hawa, and exercise self-restraint in the face of that which is unlawful for you. For indeed, self-restraint engenders within the soul a proper balance regarding what it likes and what it dislikes. So he's telling him, before you go about being governor, cleanse yourself on the inside. You have to be balanced. You have to be pure. You have to have high comportment. You have to be virtuous. And he says, then fuse your heart with mercy for the subjects, for the people over whom you rule, with love for them and kindness toward them. Be not like a ravenous beast of prey above them, seeking to devour, for they are of two types, either your brother in religion or your like in creation. That's a famous line comes from, that we all use. He says, mistakes slip from them, defects emerge from them, deliberate or not. So bestow upon them your forgiveness and your pardon, just as you have God bestow on you his forgiveness and his pardon. For you are above them, and the one who has authority over you is above you, and God is above him who appointed you. And this is the key. This is the principle. We all, when we interact with other human beings, we tend to be selfish. We tend to want our rights. We tend to want other people to do justice by us, but when we're in the wrong, we say, God, please forgive me. If you're going to judge other people by the criteria of justice, then it's only fair that God judges you by the criteria of justice. And I don't know about you, but that would terrify me. We all pray for mercy. We all seek forgiveness. So when it comes to other people, what the Imam is teaching us is that we need to be people of rahab, to have just this expansiveness in our hearts for other people. We need to be people of compassion, people of mercy, people of forgiveness. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Subhana Rabbika Rabbil Izzati Amma Yasifun. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, brothers. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Just another reminder, the Islamic Center is having a fashion show next Saturday for $20. So if you would like, just for the sisters by the way, so if you would like a ticket, please come see me. Also, next Friday is our program celebrating the birth of Imam Ali alayhi salam with a lecture by Sayyid Saleh Al-Amin, poetry by Sister Fatima Najdi, and a maulid by Brother Rami Sheja. This concludes our program for tonight.